All right, thanks very much, everybody. We're going to be talking today about quite an exciting new project that we're working on at ACLED with WorldPop. It's called Conflict Exposure, and it was motivated by really, I'm sure, an experience we've all had, which is that I was trying to get population data for the events that I was analyzing, and I realized that this was maybe the 1800th time I've had to do this exercise, and I thought there must be a better way than this. So about a year ago, I thought I should call up the WorldPop person who is down the street, thank you so much, Branka, down the street at the University of Southampton, and we should work out some sort of a arrangement. And that's how it started. And so the question we are often trying to answer is, how many people are affected by each of the events that ACLED covers? So as mentioned earlier by Kariyun, we collect almost real-time information on conflict events and demonstrations with some strategic developments. We release those data every week. And there are, on average, every week, how many rows of data? Yeah, a few thousand rows of data every week. And it seemed like a mammoth job to associate every one of those locations in those rows of data with a population, but we thought we can do it. So our question is, how many people live in direct proximity to conflict events? Today I'll mainly focus on armed organized violence rather than demonstrations. So we were looking at the incidence scale, so that at the event scale, how many people are exposed to violence? At the event type scale, if I was to try to estimate how many people in Nigeria have been exposed to an event of violence against civilians, at the actor scale, what is the proportion of the population that, for example, Boko Haram may have affected in northern Nigeria versus ISWAP has affected in northern Nigeria? So we can also do that. And then relative to the country's population, what percentage of the population in a country is directly exposed to violence at a regular occurrence? So here is our 2002 conflict exposure rate within 5 kilometers. So we've chosen 5 kilometers. We can of course choose any sort of distance between 1 kilometer to 5, etc. But we chose 5 because it's armed organized violence. Of course, if I was living in a place with a protest, I would not necessarily be exposed if it happened a kilometer away, or 5 kilometers away, but 5 kilometers for armed organized violence is where we settled at for these maps. And you can see here, there's quite a range. We've highlighted some of the most exposed populations in this map. So what you can see is that in Ukraine, 50% of the population has been exposed to at least one episode of armed organized violence in 2002. In Myanmar, it's 51%. In Palestine, both territories, it's almost 100%. Israel, of course, is 55%, as is Yemen. Now, these may seem like very, very high totals, and we'll discuss really how many people are repeatedly exposed or exposed to particular types of conflict. But what we can see here is that the populations living in these countries are variously exposed to armed organized violence, even if those occurrences are repeated or singular. But one of the things I find interesting, and I'll come back to it, is the population of Mali, right? Mali is one of the most violent places in the world at the moment by event counts and by fatality counts, but only 26% of its population is regularly exposed to violence, 4% at a 1 kilometer level. So 4% of Mali's population is within 1 kilometer of every armed organized event, but 26% is within 5 kilometers of the armed organized events. So when people ask, why is the population of Mali so favorable to the coup? It's because most of the population of Mali has no experience with the violence in that country. That's why. Or the same can be said of Congo. It's incredibly narrowly defined, the area that has repeated episodes of violence, rather than broadly defined. Okay, so it's a relatively simple methodology. We mapped ACLED conflict buffers here at 5 kilometers over WorldPop rasters by year back to 2018. We have a distance buffer. We wanted to make sure that we didn't overcount, so we merged locations that were within 5 kilometers of each other and split that population. And of course, there's other demographic characteristics collected by World Pop, including age and sex ratios, which Andrew will talk about in just a bit. So here's an example, 2018, 19, 20, and 21. This is, of course, the eastern part of DRC, and you can see that these buffers change. And in total, the amount of the population exposed to violence in turn changes. As I mentioned, the polygons that overlap are dissolved to avoid double counting, etc. And what we found, and this is aggregated up to the ADM1 level, is that these totals are quite different than the incident totals. So the incident geography is similar, but it's not the same as the exposed populations, because the underlying population itself and how dense it is, where it is, rural, urban, etc., is quite different than the simple, let's say, apolitical space that we would normally talk about events. Okay? So here we have, of course, Congo, Syria, and Mexico, and Andrew can go over the details of how different, in subtle ways, some of these geographies are. But of course, what we can see is that some of the most intense areas that have been exposed tend to be in Congo, some of the most densely populated areas, in Syria, some of the least, plus often capital cities. Okay, I have a little video, which is very exciting, and some conclusions. So what we're finding, of course, is in 2018, we've got between 3 and 25% of the global population lived close to disorder. About 17% of the global population lived within 5 kilometers. 2019, you can see how this has changed. We mean exposure to be a complement to things like fatality information. These are the people who are still left. In 2020, the exposure rate for protests jumped 5%. The exposure rate for armed organized violence decreased by 1%. And of course, these countries are changing quite rapidly. Myanmar's exposure rate has gone up 44%. Yemen's has gone down 17%. And of course, it can tell us, as I mentioned earlier, about differences of opinion within the same country, or differences of exposure even within the same state. So I'm happy to go over that little video again. It took me a long time to make it. Okay. So here, as I mentioned before, we have in 2002, all events has a population exposure at 1 km of 4%. And of course, of fatal events, armed organized events, and demonstrations all differ. Okay? So the exposure rate at 1 km, which is very, very close, is relatively small. At 5 km, it's 30%, so almost 1 in 3 are exposed to at least one riot, one protest, or one act of armed organized violence. But really what we're looking at here is armed organized events is about 17%. 17% of the global population is what is intermittently or regularly exposed to armed organized events in their home area in 2002. And this, unfortunately, has increased in 2023. So these are like a ratio of the national population. But as I mentioned before, these data will be merged with the event data. So you can get for every event the number of people who've been exposed at the 1, 2, and 5 kilometer level. And here's what I meant by exposed population by exposure type, being repeated one event or latent. Latent means that they were exposed the year before, but they're not exposed actively this year. And you can see, of course, is that in the world, we've got about 12% are repeatedly exposed. So this tells us that most events that are occurring in the world occur repeatedly in the same locations. Diffusion is there, but it's not as pronounced, let's say, as the one-time exposure rate, which is about 19%. And the rest, of course, is latent, which means that some areas are and some are not. In Afghanistan, for example, we have a very high rate of repeated events, which means there's more than 5, I believe. There's more than 5 events occurring in 1 year in the same location, affecting the same population. Now, when I mean that it's a complement to fatality information, this 30% of the Afghan population that's repeatedly exposed, they haven't died, they're just repeatedly exposed to violence, and they will require relief that is associated with that type of threat and risk, okay? It gives us a number and a location to direct some of this relief. You can see, of course, in Haiti, we have an incredibly high rate of repeated exposure. People are exposed over and over and over again in the same locations. Myanmar is the same. Iraq and Guatemala are also quite similar. As I mentioned before, this is now associated with events, and in 2023, populations are more extensively exposed to violence against civilians than they are to battles and bombs. Which is interesting, of course. What we have is we have a really intense, very, very intense clustering of battles and bombs at a very high rate in locations of Ukraine, Myanmar, and areas of the Sahel, particularly Nigeria, right? And of course, parts of Syria. But the really intense, or the locations of VAC are far more varied. Even of the repeated actions of VAC are far more varied than they are for battles and bombs, and this is riots. As we can see, as we know, Nigeria, hotbed of riots and protests. In fact, in this case, it's just riots and protests, or just riots and mob violence, and most of South Asia, which is where that type of threat is dominant. And what we can see here, of course, is our communities, literal communities, more exposed to particular types of violence, and should our response be catered to the types of violence they're most exposed to? I'm actually going to let Andrew take over at this point, but to demonstrate, of course, we started this in 2018, we've gone up to 2023, and the risk has increased substantially. Do you want this?
Sure. Okay. So far, in parentheses here, you can see we've only focused on aggregating the total population living within every one of these regions, right? So for every pixel in the raster layer from WorldPop, we have the total count. But what I frankly didn't know when we first started was that we have this age and sex demographic breakdown, right, for each, which would allow us to use a tool that's very common for demographers and population geographers, population pyramid, to try to understand if there's an even burden across cohorts within a population and across the gender and sex balance within the area, right? And so this is a admittedly sort of exploratory exercise. It was. And so I'm going to run through a handful of kind of proof of concept illustrations. But before doing that, I do want to say this has deteriorated slightly, the quality, excuse me. I want to say that there are cases of precedent for this approach that we'll be looking through. And so this includes an earlier example, for example, Hagen and Polanyi in Science use age-specific mortality rates and counting victims in Darfur, right? So you have under 15, 15 to 23, 30 to 44 in the center, and so on, right? And they also distinguish between sex, gender. Burnham et al. Did this in Lancet as well. One of the limitations of these, though, is that they use either household survey data, which is very expensive to collect and not always representative across individual cases, or they use mortality statistics official hospital records, right, which are also not very routinely available or consistently collected and standardized across countries. So what we're trying to do is something similar to this, right, which has established precedent in the literature, but for all of the countries around the world over many, many years. So here's just an example of a population pyramid, which I know people are familiar with, right? But we have 4-year cohorts distinguishing between male and female populations all the way up to 80 or 100 years, depending on the outlet preferences of particular organizations and so on. So here's one example. Again, sort of a proof of concept model here. We take 2022, we're using the organized armed events within 5 kilometers of a person's location and counting the population there, right? So this is simplified, slightly, but you can see,
Let me move these.
you can see on the slides on the columns, there's a bit of a bulge in the population pyramid here in the cohorts of roughly 15 to 20 to 25 to 30-year-old female populations in Uganda, right? And this is, when I first started seeing this, I thought that's striking, right? There's clearly a burden for one part of the population that is uneven, right? And the further you go through this, we found a bunch of different examples of this. Now, explaining this is something I'm happy to talk about afterward. I mean, I think there are potential explanations for why this particular population has a conflict burden that's imbalanced. But an obvious question would be whether this mirrors the baseline population of the country, right? So we want to compare the two. Obviously, you know, the population in general looks like panel B on the right. It's what you would expect, right? It's a progressive population pyramid fitting with Uganda's stages of development. And the next step is to, oh, excuse me, this is just another example of some of the variation within a country.
Yeah, that's it.
Within a country, we can do the same kind of analysis, right? So this is for 2020. This is the conflict-affected sum of the population, or the conflict burden, within 5 kilometers, still organized armed violence. I'm sorry, I'm trying to be very clear. Yeah, so we can have the entire country's population. The negative sign on the left-hand side of that axis is just required for me to construct these. But we can have different zones within the country. So Oromia, Tigray, and Amhara have different conflict burden profiles, right? So we can do this at a national level, but I also, as part of this proof of concept, wanted to establish the fact that we can do this at a subnational level. Again, these are deteriorated. Okay, so I've moved through a handful of these just to demonstrate that these population pyramids look like we would expect for each of the respective countries, but also that we can evaluate the population share burdened by conflict. So Burundi, in 2021, at the top, you can see the total count exposed, the female-male share of the population exposed, and you can see that it's a fair share of the overall population, right? So the teal color on the inside is the exposed population, and the baseline population is in the pink color. So Burundi was 26th globally in 2021, and this is the distribution of the burden of conflict. Nigeria, similarly, a progressive population pyramid, which is what we would expect, and here are the exposed shares. Central African Republic, Angola. In the interest of time, I'll move through these, but we can come back. But to demonstrate that these are fitting, Colombia again has a slightly more stationary population pyramid, right, with a smaller number, respectively, of the younger cohorts within the country, but still a fair share of exposed population. Greece has almost a fully regressive population pyramid, which checks out, right? Myanmar, and then Syria in 2021, again, we're seeing what we would expect to see, right? Which is that the majority of the population has been exposed to organized armed violence within 5 kilometers of their home. And we produce these for every country. We can do it with mass atrocities. We can do it with repeated events, and I clearly don't have time to run through all of those. But this is the kind of principle for the burden of armed conflict. Would you like to finish?
Sure. I will say that what we're doing now with Karin's very patient help is we're integrating, as we mentioned before, this into the ACLA data at the event scale. So when you download the data in, I believe, January is my hoped for time, you will also be allowed to download the populations beside each event. We're trying to determine at some point when we're all here together whether or not it's useful to do what we would call a best count. So for example, rather than presenting 1, 2, or 5 kilometer population rates beside every event, is it better to say, well, listen, this was a peaceful protest, so we're going to include the 1 kilometer population rate here, but we're going to include the 5 kilometer population rate for an event with a fatality, which is about half of all armed organized events, or a particularly difficult type of event, like a battle, etc., or a bomb. We have we'll be trialing some of these different best count measures, along with, of course, the raw data itself. I don't actually remember what number 3 is, and now you've skipped it.
This is why most people don't do presentations together.
Wait, yes. Oh, we're trying to also, of course, to determine best practices, because what can end up happening is that if you just added up all the populations that that it will be in that column, you could overcount, in fact, more than the population of the state for that year, the population. So there'll be some, let's say, some guided rules about how best to employ these counts. And we hope to continue this, and that it has some sort of relevance in your own work and applicability.
I returned to this slide just quickly to offer a glimmer, at least, of a plausible explanation for why we might see something like this imbalanced conflict burden in 2020 in Uganda. I'm a academic. I like that term.
Yeah, that's good.
So this ideally is helpful for a host of different organizations, different people. But we might also want to test social science inferences about conflict behavior. And just bear with me, but like this share. The female share of the population in these lower middle-aged cohorts, a plausible explanation for why the burden might exist there could have something to do with whether or not the conflict events taking place in this country, in this context, are primarily rural versus urban, right? And if most of the violence is taking place in a rural context, and we know that there's an imbalance there due to people going to cities to work, then there's a plausible explanation for why.
You were talking about the feminization of rural spaces, yes?
It was.
Okay, that helps.
So I think I'll just leave it there. We got to our next steps, 1, 2, 3, and let us know your questions.
Or if we've explained this so well, you don't have any. Yes, sir. Oh, yes. Great. Well, I look forward to Christine's presentation.
So, how do I change what happens to the presentation? Are you going to change it for me when I say, or is there a clicker? Oh, there's a clicker.
So
the green
one should be
advancing the slides. All right, so the conference name is, should I use a microphone for the people, or is it okay?
Yes.
Okay. And does this work? Yes, it sounds like it does. Okay, we're there. So we've talked all day about data for peace, but a lot of it has been about conflict. So in ways, what this tracker asks is, what if instead of looking for conflict, we tried to look for peace, and we tried to think about what are the ways that we might understand what the peace impacts are of a peace process. And I would go into afterwards, maybe in the Q&A, why it might be important. But we know that for every conflict action, there are communities trying to counteract it in ways, and it can be important to look for that. Oh. It's not changing. Did I press? So from 1990 onwards, there was a change post-Cold War of peacemaking practices and a form of formalising peace agreements as a way of ending conflict to war with direct face-to-face negotiations between armed actors, constrained by, over time, human rights mechanisms and norms, became very much the predominant way of exiting conflict. This is just a few of them. Our own special one, and I always ask my students which one of these is not like the other ones from Sesame Street. Quick answers. So I'm going to tell you because, yeah.
There's a woman in one.
Yes, that's the right answer. Well, it's one of a number of right answers, but yes, there's only really one shows a woman mediator. We'll come back to that. So just to quickly show you, this was actually an unsung good news story. Conflict reduced, not year on year, but in a trend over time, from until actually 2012. Sorry, the data's a bit wrong in this. Until 2012, when the deaths in Syria alone started reversing that trend, and that's a photo from Syria. Conflict's now on the rise again. That trend's firmly done. I think all ACLED data has been very useful to showing that today. While it was a fairly good news story and deaths and conflict ended, it was less good at producing positive peace in terms of and I define that here just as self-renewing, sustainable political orders that could replace violence as a way of transacting power relations. I'm going to try and go to, is it possible to click on this complicated implication thing and go into the website, should be a click. Right, so don't click anything here for a minute, just scroll up a bit. Right, so if they had the perfect peace process, it would start with a ceasefire, followed by pre-negotiation, followed by partial agreement, maybe a comprehensive agreement, implement, and then peace forevermore. So just if you could click on this, click to start. No, here, yeah. But this is what peace processes actually look like. This is all the peace processes in the world. If you hover on them there, you'll see that they bring up certain one. And what you can see is they don't go in a linear direction, right? We were able to plot that because our data disaggregates all the peace agreements over a trajectory in all these categories. And what you see is there's forward and backward motion. That's one of our coolest visualizations, and actually one that internationals and local people perceive differently. Internationals get very depressed about this. They suddenly realize they're only involved in one little bit of the process. It may not matter as much as they thought. Local people are often uniquely depressed, feeling their conflicts going really, really bad, their peace process going really, really badly, and actually find this strangely encouraging when they find out they're all that way, and it doesn't mean they're doomed to failure. Although, of course, many do fail. If we go back to the presentation, then you can find that and play around with it yourselves if you want. I don't mind if you do it in the talk. So just, now I have to find the presentation. Ooh. That was, oh, yeah. So what is the aim of the tracker? The aim of the tracker I'm going to present is to support adaptive management of peace processes, because it's clear you're not rolling out a linear line. It's a platform rather than one thing, and to design tracking of a peace process by using less data rather than more, reducing down to the data that people use and trust already, using resources that we think are reliable, in ways that can be triangulated so that you can compare, because they all have different strengths and weaknesses. Great ACLED article on the relative strengths and weaknesses recently of ACLED, along with our own database of peace agreements. And the idea is to try to converge data and try to relate it in some ways to the types of question people ask, so that missing gap. I'm just going to skip over. The intended end users are those in-country teams from often international organisations and countries who have to land in country with lots of information, but not necessarily fine granulated access to it. Those groups that are monitoring progress of a peace transition process, because many of those are put in place, and need ways to understand and benchmark change. Local actors and populations seeking to represent views and highlight important issues, and the research community itself focused on peace and transition processes to understand what implementation might mean and what success and failure, because we've no definitions of them, coming to that in a minute, actually look like. All of the data begins with our peace agreement database, which has now 2003 formal peace agreements with a complex definition. We actually have a separate, it's really a suite of data tools with separate local agreements database across 170 peace processes. So this is a majority world phenomenon. They have full text of PDF of the agreements, and there's an online corpus that can be used for machine learning. And we've systematically coded those through human learning, although we're starting to incorporate very much, I think, like one of the other people said, automated ways of doing a first cull through an AI, natural language programming tool we've developed. And that's the peace agreement database. What we're trying to now do is create a peace and transition process tracker. We've got a number of countries on it. And this is what it looks like. It doesn't try to come up with one thing. It gives you different ways of seeing. And I really like this John Berger art idea. He was an art critic. He talked about paintings as being ways of seeing, right? Different ways of seeing the world that provoke you to see the world in a different way. And actually, the last talk was a brilliant example of that, I think, people's proximity to conflict. So first of all, for each case, we've got a timeline of formal change processes where we have built in peace agreements, but also coups, election data, and constitutions. Again, I can talk about what the sources are. It's quite cool. You can just flick back and forward. You can jump to just one line or look at them all. And in fact, you can access all the documents and underlying data directly from the timeline. Then we have a process overview of the peace processes, which shows you kind of what main themes they dealt with. And again, you can jump backwards into the underlying data if you want more detail. We've pulled out all the people who've signed the agreements and put them into networks so you can see, and we've got data coming out where we map that on to armed actor data, and we've created big dictionaries of how all the armed actors' names change. To understand who has signed agreements, who haven't, as a way of supplementing analysis when people are looking at what a particular armed group's doing. This is really interesting because, for example, in Afghanistan, at some point relatively far into the current phase of process, I noticed a name that I recognised and realised this guy who was signing from the Northern Alliances had signed the exact same agreement 20 years before in a totally earlier phase. And of course, he knows what he's doing when he signs those agreements. But it would be quite important maybe to understand that he'd done that before when you were shepherding him through an agreement that you maybe thought was going to go a certain way. We then incorporated, and I've very little time to show this, but implementation data, which we've taken pre-selected data that we think relates to two things, what we call conflict impacts, where we really use ACLED and who've been incredibly helpful to us, and UCDP data. And you can track that, for example, with reference to the agreement and the 100 days before and after the agreement as a line, and you can explore it in other ways. And those are the conflict impacts, so that have deaths and conflict and events reduced or not. The second thing we've done is talk about peace impact. So peace can't really be measured, right? It's not really a thing. So Richard Kaplan, whose work has been very useful in this regard, says, but there's certain things that we think peace looks like and does that has certain impacts. And this is the best measure we have, I think we have, of talking about success. And those impacts often can be measured. So we've got what we think are the approximate measurements for that from regular data. There's a big issue with subnational processes, which are very difficult and we're still working on. But we've got these bundled by security, political and economic indicators that give you a picture of a process. And instead of coming up with a big data thing, we've got a little dashboard that just shows you, are these things getting better or worse? And the idea is not to say, this is what is happening, but to say, are these things real? Are they a product of the data artifact and collection effort? And if they're real and things are not going together that we think are going together, what's the conversation we should have around that? We have not in every case a conflict map, but I think this one's interesting to use because in Ukraine we tried to create a map of maps where we tried to reflect power plants, UCTB data, conflict data. We've only got it with Ukraine. And then this is really interesting. This is data that was collected in the first 2 to 3 months of the conflict by HZ Zurich on all the humanitarian corridors access. And they're color-coded by how they ended and whether they were finally agreed. But it's just, I pointed out for the peace monitoring, at a time when we were saying, and the dominant narrative was that there was no dialogue and no prospect of resolution in Ukraine, which of course at one level is true. This is actually all the dialogue that was ongoing, that was involving all the conflict parties. So it presents quite a different picture, I think, of what was going on. In Ukraine also, we've done a thing that we can roll out further, and we've actually done it for the UK because we were interested, because we're funded by FCDO. We pulled out Russia and everywhere it had acted as a sort of, in quotes, peace actor. And we've created quite a nice, I can show you some of this live if you want, but I'm going to stop here. We've presented quite a nice sort of network mapping of who they signed with and what agreements were that tells a story about how Russia's peace mediation efforts have changed, how different they are for their proximate countries and faraway countries, etc., and how it changed over time. And again, we think that's quite useful to understanding how people might enter any dialogue, for example, over Ukraine. That's an example of the timeline. These are all the I'm just going to skip through these, but they give you a sense of what each of those I should have gone through. That's, by the way, all the third-party actors. Really surprising thing is that second to United Nations in signing, partly because the modality of fractionalized agreements, Russia was the next biggest actor. Bit of a surprise to us. This is the actor network mapping. Again, it's interesting because it just shows who the common parties are between what have been different bunches. This is the Russia as a peace actor data over time. This is all the data that we have drawn on for the tracker. And these are the bundles of peace and conflict impact. So I should have really flicked through that as I gave the talk, but there you go. But this kind of shows you composite indicators that give you a quick picture, and then others. This last one is a new experiment where we're using the natural language tool that we generated to help us automate our coding, our topic coding, and we're actually using it to produce narrative implementation records. So this works by comparing semantic similarity. Interestingly, using some of the open source Google frameworks, so appropriate, I'm saying it in this building. And so we put in provisions of the agreement, and then we can extract the provisions that relate to that in narrative implementation. And the idea is that this narrative implementation support, where we have good, able to be processed narrative implementation reports, can be used. So if anyone wants to give us their reports to try, JMEC's really well structured and open access. We use those in South Sudan for proof of concept. So finally, the idea is just to finish, support adaptive management of peace processes, make peacemaking itself more visible, integrate global data and local perceptions. I didn't actually mention that, but in our research project we have local perceptions data being collected at a very granular detail in many of those case studies that we then can present and integrate. So we've kind of got this global data and it's telling one thing, and the local data is sometimes telling something different about what people's perceptions of peace are. And again, that opens a conversation as to what might be going on here. Is it an artifact of the data collection on either end, or is it something real we should pay attention to? It provides a variety of ways of seeing. And then we do have an ambition that relates to some of the things people were asking of this morning, to both demonstrate and create interoperable data. We've built the ACLED, the UCDB codes, the other codes into our data. We've created a database. We've engineered it on a massive computer that has the Edinburgh Parallel Computing. So I think it's the largest computer in the UK. So we've kind of got the computer capacity, and we've created new ways of doing through natural language processing, dashboarding, and interactive visualization. And all of this, the underlying tools, the ambition is we've documented everything we've done to try to put in place a new research infrastructure that would be reusable. But of course, we won't be the only people. We come to events like this and it becomes enriched and connected with through, but to some extent we were hoping for that. Somebody called it radical interoperability, and I like that. I don't want to present us as radical, but very much we're trying to demonstrate and to leave behind and to be part of. So thank you very much.
We have some time for questions for all the presenters. Yes, if you can go in front, all of you, I think that would be better. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, sure.
I think we have like 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to be brief.
That's why you're not in the corner.
Okay, thanks a lot. This was really, really interesting. I'm a consultant at the Innovation Cell in UNDDPA and a PhD. The first question I had for the first presentation was, could it be worthwhile to perhaps study the case of underrepresented or overrepresented, or overexposure rather, to conflict as a question of radius? So perhaps there are populations that are confronted to conflict within a closer radius, and then those that are very distant from the conflict, depending on, let's say, physical contact, but also perhaps the most distant radius being also exposure through media, through, for example, more, let's say, for example, lots of Ukrainian citizens being exposed to the conflict in the situation as refugees through, for example, very violent social media content. That would be my first question for the first presentation. And the second question is, for the second presentation, could it be interesting or worthwhile to consider public initiatives for peace building or reconciliation as also part of your data sets?
Thanks. Can we take 1 second person and then... Oh, I didn't see. Sorry.
My notebook up.
Sorry.
Yeah, question for Kleena and Andy. Kleena, when you were talking about Mali, it obviously rang a bell because at the moment there's a few perception surveys that are being developed at the subnational level. There's CIPRI and there's Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And I was wondering if it might be apt to actually, talk to them because in effect, perceptions vary between the South and the center because of exposure. Even perceptions on MINUSMA, which you would expect maybe to be the same because they're supposed to be a force for good, are not the same perceptions. And so that's an additional layer of trying to gauge people's perceptions because usually that's not captured in data sets. You have to go out and ask people about this. And the timing at which you ask them is also very important. At a time of election, at a time of after a coup and all these things. And Afrobarometer is doing an amazing job there. But oftentimes it's at the national level. And because violence tends to be concentrated in certain areas, it's not a countrywide phenomenon. It's important for the metric to be representative of the subnational variation. And of course you have indices like Inform Risk Index or the Global Peace Index. They have one number for one country, so you're averaging everything into one number. And that can sometimes be problematic. So when you guys disaggregate to that degree, I'm wondering if you're looking into maybe complement it when possible, or even stimulate funding going into perceptions data, because I think that's actually the missing piece that we're having in this data ecosystem. What do people think? Can we survey them? Do we have the resources? Are the sample sizes big enough? What are the challenges if we want to go ask people who are in conflict zones? I think that's super interesting just to add value to what you're doing.
Thanks.
And we had one more.
Hey, so I will also try to be brief. So to the first presentation, Kleena, you ask whether or not you should use kind of different buffer zones. Yes, that would be cool. And you can estimate it, right? We can talk more about that. But, different conflicts have different dynamics and different countries have different infrastructure and so on and so forth. So having like an estimate of what is actually the buffer zone. I don't know. I would like to hear a practitioner tell me if that is just totally, useless. But at least as an academic, I think that would be super exciting. But also I would like to hear your thoughts on what about kind of individual level factors because exposure could also be understood as, something radiated out from a conflict, which is depending on the conflict kind of intensity, magnitude, and then individual level factors, like gender, age, class, whatever, and so on, right? So that could also be super interesting to hear a bit about. And then just for the second presentation, how do you, just your thoughts about, how do you know that, a group has either, fallen out, an actor group have fallen out, or a new group comes into existence, or whether or not it is just an old group taking a new name. So that kind of weird dynamic. Yes, thanks.
Thanks. I'll try.
I know we have more questions, but...
Sure. Can everybody hear me?
You might be better to take it because I think it's maybe the people online might struggle.
Oh, right. Thanks very much. I'll just briefly go over some, and I'm sure Andy has some things to say. What I will say is that there is a million applications of these data, which I'm very excited about, and I hope you all do whatever you wish with them because they will be public and they will be yours and you can do as you wish. You can look at perceptions. You can look at, in my case, I'm really interested in looking at whether or not we see more new groups form in areas that have been repeatedly exposed or those that have not been repeatedly exposed, or whether or not we're seeing more attacks on mayors and other civil servants in areas that have a unique kind of conflict signature. It's one of my long-term research interests to think about how conflicts have signatures. And I never quite was able to get to it from events, even event types or fatalities. And I think that the populations they choose to expose to violence will be fundamental to understanding the signature. So I cannot wait to hear all the things you do with it. And all of those suggestions sounded incredible.
Thanks very much. They're great questions and wonderful suggestions. I was able to jot down a few notes. For the question about distances, there's kind of a short answer, which is that, it takes very little time to just do this at 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers, right? So short answer is we can do it at any distance. But that's not the most thoughtful answer, right? I think you're right about exposure through other mechanisms or other forums or other mediums. Exposure through social media might be a little tricky, though, because that's very individually determined, right? And I think we're trying to get at the kinds of impacts that involve infrastructure, right, and damage to trade networks and the provision of public goods and those kinds of things, less about individual level psychological mechanisms, which are tremendously important but can't be measured with the kind of observations we have. About surveys, independent of this work, I love surveys. I use surveys. We have original surveys in conflict countries. I've used Afrobarometer. I've used DHS surveys. They're phenomenal. Yeah, but there are these issues of the data generating process not being universal, right? Which limits generalizability. So surveys are fantastic, though. The last question I'll just address, you mentioned infrastructure. We have in the data from the World POP team, Andy's group, we have the land use classifications of each one of these pixels as well. So we have the demographic characteristics of the area, but we also have whether it's an urban area, whether it's classified as a rural area, whether it's classified as cropland, whether it's classified as ice or rock even. Those might be less interesting for us. But we can make the same sort of disaggregations that we have in the demographic arena with infrastructure and land use, which is something we're also planning to do a little bit further down the line that has to do with not the people who are burdened by conflict, but the places that are burdened by conflict. And, I'm in a geography department, so that interests me, and Clina too.
So I had one question about local people. Yes, for me, the Holy Grail would be to have people reflecting their own peacemaking practices back, and that's, as data. There's a number of, and there are some things that we could do that we are looking to do. For example, places that have multi-donor trust funds, there's pretty good data of what those projects are. They're all geolocated, like, say, the one in South Sudan. There's a couple of issues I think are tricky with that, which is number one, forms of gaming of anything. We know basically anytime we create a measurement or a way of reflecting things, that changes what people do in ways that we can't predict, right? And the second thing is security. And not everywhere could those projects be put up and be put up in that way. But for me, people seeing themselves in the data and having stories come into the data and returning the data to people and understanding their interaction is also telling us something would be really a big ambition, but we would need help from whoever's out there in doing that. What was my second question? Oh, yes. Well, I'm not the technical person, so there's a better answer than this. But essentially what we've done was we used forms of NLP to pull entity named recognition out of things, both for international organisations who've slightly varied names over time. States actually change their names more than you would think, and also for armed actors. We know within some contexts why they changed and which are like for like. The more subtle differences of what that that change really meant. No, we're not going to pick it up in that sort of granularity. But what we essentially did was we took lists that were out there of names changed, because other people have done this. We took data like UCTP and other data that we're working with, and we took named entity recognition through large data sources, and we created massive dictionaries of what were the synonyms across time. And I'm sure there'll be some things we've got a bit wrong, but more or less that gives us a sense of what are like for like names. And it was quite a big piece of work. But we're hoping then that that can support, and other people will maybe advise us on what we've got right and wrong.
Let's do a quick second round of questions, maybe take two, because we're running out of time. I know you wanted to.
I do. I'll be very, very brief. My name is Connor. I work with UNHCR. Building on the comment in relation to perceptions, one of the aspects with your presentation from ACLED was, in addition to exposure, and well done on breaking down the conceptual aspect of it geographically, everything. I'm a geographer, urban planner by background as well, is the whole aspect of normalization. Yeah, there's a few of us around. The whole aspect of normalization, in which, yeah, as well, and how different cultures, contexts can normalize violence, but also then let's stretch it a bit further, and looking forward with the complexities of climate change and the Armageddon we're all apparently facing, is resilience in communities. And I think the two go very much hand in hand. And the only research that kind of stands out at this, which is still very scant, is on gender-based violence, and how commercial sex workers, how individuals, young youth, women, etc., girls, have normalized certain aspects of gender-based violence. But anyway, it's just to throw it out there. And the reason I ask it is because I have been involved with that ground truthing surveys in Somalia, in Colombia, and it's like, pardon the expression, flogging a dead horse, trying to extract, understand conceptually, culturally, etc., what is really going on behind the scenes. And you do need that qualitative element, and I would say a triggering factor that kind of throws in a group discussion, especially to try and really elucidate and understand the complexities around that as well. The question I would have then is, jumping all of this, is in relation to, we work with a lot of dashboards, and a lot of, in our individual organizations, UN or otherwise, we have a lot of dashboards going around. What is getting increasingly hard for us is to, what are the questions our principals should be asking at wink wink meetings in the next 6 months, years ahead, on strategic foresight, on anticipatory policy and planning? What are the key questions that we need to think about to inform them in asking the data, the myriad and the more and more data, and hopefully better analysis that will come out there? Because admittedly, it's becoming very crowded at the moment. That's all.
Is there any more last question? Yes.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. I had a quick question on the data from WorldPop that you're using for ACLED on the conflict areas, because dynamics in conflict areas are changing very rapidly. So how do you get proper, reliable data on making those kind of assessments on how many people are living in the areas? Like, because you're dealing with a lot of displacements, and also how feeds that in any predictive modeling? Because it's, the WorldPop data on Syria, for example, like there are no official data. Like, do you get it from NGOs or from UN agencies? And how reliable is the data if people are not doing surveys? For example, we do a lot of work in northeast Syria, in particular, for example, looking at Deir ez-Zor and looking at your map of Deir ez-Zor and Hasaka. It's really, really difficult to make any assessments on populations there. So I think for us, we don't consider WorldPop data as reliable at this moment to make any assessment linking with the event. So how do you navigate sort of those kind of limitations with using those public data sets?
That's an excellent question. I'll start there. So I think WorldPop data is the most reliable population data that we've come across. And I would say that they would have the exact same reservations about deeply conflicted areas, right? And so we take an annual cut of their data, and the annual differences can also account for things like the movement possibilities, especially within zones. I'll be the first to say, though, that it's not very common for people to leave conflict areas as much as we think, in part because we've not understood the long tail of conflict, which is that the events themselves, the individual events, don't prompt people to leave. What's happening at the moment in Gaza would prompt mass movement, but that is a quite unique type of event, in the same way that you know, Eastern Ukraine is a quite unique type of event. So that aside, I will say that World Pop is very adamant about making sure that we all represent this as an estimate of that population, and an estimate that is often based on satellite imagery, census where possible, and then truthed, if that can be used as a verb, as often as possible and whenever possible after the fact. So you might remember that there was quite a fuss because the population of Papua New Guinea was double what everybody thought it was. Do you remember that this summer? Oh, well, it kind of fed into this narrative that no one in Papua New Guinea knows anything about Papua New Guinea. But it turns out that it was in part because the World Pop assessment was not complete. And in fact, when it was complete, it was ground truth and it was quite reliable, but people would take the most extreme representation of this process of creating data without necessarily a census. I don't think there's been a census in Papua New Guinea for quite a while. And then try to almost overestimate its errors rather than to take what is the most reliable estimate at a time where in a conflict area or in a difficult to access area. So there are caveats to the exact number of people for sure in those cases. But the second is that this is the beginning of our attempt to make sure that our data and that anybody who's open to it have interoperable data. So whether it's radical or not, we're hoping, for example, that we can have more chats with IDMC about internal displacement, and we can look more at the population movements that we know are happening even within the annual time frame to make sure that we can accurately estimate what's happening in country. So we're very hopeful that we can get better estimates. I mean, at the moment, people are using country estimates, or they're using ADM1 estimates, or the PIN, for example, is also quite similar to that. And this is, by and large, a massive improvement on it. To answer your question, Connor, I've actually forgotten what it is, so I can't at the moment, but I'm sure we'll have it, but I'll come back to it.
This comment is a fantastic comment, and I wrote down surveys again, right? I mean, I couldn't agree more. The best estimate you're going to get is something that's ground truthed in some kind of way. I mean, about perceptions. And it's related also to this question about World Pop data reliability. So the super generic response would be that this has something to do with balancing the trade-offs between, you know, specificity in one case and generalizability in the other, and using data that may not be exact to the individual person, right, in a location, but are the closest thing that we can get from the most reliable source. And another quick note about the World Pop data. So many people in here know, but this is a combination of sources, right? They're weighted and used with a series of algorithms to assign the population from a national or an administrative unit level down to a very precise level. And Kalina mentioned satellite data, but there are actually many different layers of remote sensing data. So nighttime lights imagery, for example, can be part of these algorithms, part of this recipe. And if all the lights go out in a place, that's taken into account when World Pop weights the areas that they're assigning populations to. So that's just a consideration, I guess.
So I'll maybe just respond generally on what should people be asking themselves. Out of our broader work on this, and you know, maybe this is a controversial note, but I think that what's quite interesting in really the last 2 years is how many of the conflicts we're looking, the mediation practices aren't mapping on, and at the same time we're seeing a multiplicity in who's intervening in mediation, and that it's seen as a kind of global positioning thing to do now in a way that it wasn't. So I think we need to now think about what process looks like for resolving conflict actually looks like in those contexts. And, you know, it's fine to track conflict and anticipate it, but unless we can actually do something about it, all we're doing is dataizing. So I suppose, you know, our work's trying to, I suppose, put a bit of a challenge in that. And you know, at the time we were thinking about this, there's another phenomenon, I think, going on, which is, first of all, the fragmentation of conflict and the fragmentation of the mediation space is ripping away one of the only things that reduced conflict since 1990. But secondly, there's been a chronic failure of early warning in the last sort of 6 months or so. It has been able to predict, I think, people can predict politically and through data that certain places are likely to go a bit bad, but they have been singularly unable to predict a Russian invasion of Ukraine until about 2 days before, a coup in Myanmar, inter-armed conflict in Sudan, and Hamas and the reaction to that. Now that's a pretty big amount of failure. And what I would say is, in each of those situations, what could anyone have done if those things had been more clearly predicted 2 weeks, a month, or even 2 months before? It's really unclear to me that anything could have been done. What can we do? We need to ask ourselves, and we do need to shift the debate to this, right? We need to identify who is practicing what we've called civicness rather than, from Mary Calder's work in our project, this is the art of combating conflict, of creating civic spaces, both as a name and as an ongoing practice. We need to understand that when we deliver aid into these situations, and I slightly wondered, I would be really controversial in here, predictive aid into situations, how are the funding channels of that aid going? Because in places like Sudan, the political marketplace of the economics of who gains from these things actually tilts the battlefield. Or are we going to start saying, where are the practices of peace and where are the positives of peace or civicness? How do we understand how those communities' voices are being supported, both in terms of how aid should be delivered in emergency situations, but also in terms of trying to use that moment to build some sort of process that's an alternative. And we're also looking at the ways in which micro-processes are agreed. Now, I sort of feel that I really, really support the data collection that's undergoing early warning. I really support all of that. But I do sometimes feel like it's sort of really dominating the data for peace field, and yet actually it was sort of interesting if everyone's saying, and we're not really sure how practice-based it is. So I don't think it should stop. Let me be super clear about that. But I think people should know what it is they're going to do when they get warned, right? And that, for me, is what people are asking in the field and should be asking. And that's what I think collectively as a group of researchers we need to come up. And I think in some ways your data thing of showing whose experience of conflict and how, for me, I can see loads of mediation things, shows how that type of thinking can come from this same data. So that's my little polemic.
Sorry. I remembered your question because, of course, Christine mentioned it. But so one of the things, Gary, who doesn't look like he's in here, mentioned something this afternoon that really supports what Christine was just saying, which is that we've never had more data and we've never had more conflict, in recent times. So there's clearly not a good relationship between, if we knew more about it, we could do more about it, because that has proved to be untrue, just like the early warning about this. And I think that, I don't want to talk against our own work, but there is a tendency to treat it like a kind of scientific problem or a lack of knowledge problem when it's a political problem, right? All of these conflicts are because of political competition, right? And that, as we mentioned before, can't be measured in that way, but you can do something about it, especially because you know who's going to be competing over what resources, over what territories, over what populations, over what positions. And as we have become wealthier, some of the most violent places, as I mentioned earlier, are some of the places with the highest economic growth or very, very strong economic growth, or have democratized. Like, these did not have the conflict mitigating properties that we thought they would, and yet we still assume that we should just have an election, everything will work itself out. We should stop that. So the question is, what do we do now? These things didn't work.
Very nice way to end the session.
Mic drop. Nothing worked.